Okay, this is the last presentation of the day, so I hope you're not fully asleep. And it's about energy, so I hope this will give you some energy. I'm following two amazing presentations, and I'll be talking at a very different level of analysis than the previous two speakers, but surprisingly there is a lot that our presentations have in common, and what I have to say really integrates with the brain research a variety of findings on the behavioral level. And I'd like to talk about that and demonstrate that. The energy concept is fundamental to natural science. Nothing happens without energy. No sound, no heat, no movement, no life. From the very molecular to the very moral level, everything requires a source of energy. In popular speak, concepts of energy are omnipresent. We talk about being energizing, lacking energy, imbibing coffee or other energizing drinks. But surprisingly in psychology, up till now, up till this session, there's been very little work on psychology, excluding the work of original vitality perhaps, and the current work by John and Kent. So why don't we take the concept of mental energy seriously? We're not the first ones to do that. We stand on the shoulders of giants, and Freud talked about it, wrote the notion of psychic energy. He thought that it's fixed. He thought that it fuels all mental activity. You need energy for mental activity, for thought, for imagination, for memory. Where does energy come from for Freud? It comes from, it's biologically based, it comes from libido. He's slightly vague on that, but he assumed that it's biologically based. We assume that there is a pool of mental energy that is fixed, and it's a function of the person and the situation. Person, genetics, people vary, reds vary from workers to slackers. People have different amounts of energy. Development, the kind of environmental developmental environment in which you grew up determine your energy, aging, and these individual differences determine the upper bound on the kind of energy you can bring to bear on current activity. The situational influences on the current pool of energy are rest, nutrition, health, depletion, dopamine mechanism, tetrabenazine, and so on and so forth. So there are both personal, individual differences and situational effects on the amount of energy that the person has. Basically, our theory of cognitive energetics is indebted to the macroeconomic theory of demand, that the outlay willingness, the willingness to expend money, in this case the willingness to expend energy, must match, in order for activity to be initiated and or completed, it must match the price. It must match the required outlay of energy. So the mental law of demand, if you will, states that for mental or behavioral activity to take place, the effective energy outlay must match the required energy outlay. So EO, effective outlay, must match the required outlay. The upper bound of effective outlay is outlay willingness, which is how much energy you're willing to expend on a given activity in order to attain a given goal. This is the upper bound. You may not need to expend all that energy because the energy requirement may be less than that. So this is the maximum amount of energy the actor is willing to expend. An activity will not happen if the required outlay of energy exceeds the willingness to outlay the energy. Because this is the upper bound of energy that you will be able to expend on the activity. And we assume that the willingness, all the important outlay willingness is a multiplicative function of the relative goal importance to the extent to which the particular motivation in relation to other goals that may be happening at the moment is dominant, is hegemonious. So we assume that relative goal importance has to do with importance of the focal goal as compared to other goals that the person may have. Human motivation is dynamic. At any given moment, the environment may stimulate a given motivation, or it can be done experimentally, and that motivation has to exceed other possible goals in the situation for it to drive behavior. And the second important factor is the pool of mental energy available to the individual at the moment, a function of the genetic and the situational factors that I described earlier. Finally, it's a function of the individual energetic conservationism, what Susan and Sherry have called cognitive miserliness. To the extent people are assumed to differ, maybe the slackers workers example would be appropriate here. People differ in how willing they are to expend energy. Some people do not care; they are big spenders energy-wise. Other people are stingy and would rather not move, sleep most of the day, get up very late, and so forth. Now, I'm assuming that the goal importance and the individual conservationism cannot multiply the amount of energy you have. They can only draw different proportions of the energy. So I'm assuming that the amount of energy you have is fixed, but you can mobilize different amounts of energy depending on your motivation, depending on your tendency to spend the energy. And that's expressed in the fact that K, which is a function of the goal importance, is a fraction, and so is L, which is a function of the economic conservatism. These are only fractions that determine proportions of energy that would be mobilized from the overall available pool of energy. So you have this pool of energy determined by genetic situation, and you have the relative goal importance and your general tendency, and that determines how much energy you'll be willing to outlay. Now, this simple theory organizes a variety of evidence, a variety of data from a variety of domains of social psychology. For example, persuasion. In the domain of persuasion, we had dual models of persuasion. Let me backtrack for one moment. The implications of this model are, first, that the relative goal importance and the pool of energy are substitutable, because both are part of this multiplicative equation. So you can enhance the outlay willingness either by increasing the motivation, or by increasing the amount of energy, or by increasing economic conservationism, but that's a function of individual tendencies. So these are mutually substitutable. In the domain of persuasion, we know that the tendency to be persuaded or form your judgment on the basis of simple versus complex arguments, peripheral or heuristic arguments versus complex message arguments, is function of either the mental resources that you have, which I would coordinate to the concept of energy, or the magnitude of motivation. The more motivation you are in the issue, the more you're willing to exert energy on processing complex message arguments, which is very similar to John's rat climbing the barrier. We don't have barriers, but we have complex message arguments, and the effort required from complex message arguments requires either greater pool of energy or greater motivation. And this has been replicated in thousands of studies around the world in the dual process model of persuasion. We have evidence from the field of memory, retrieval induced forgetting, that that particular effect retrieval, which is basically a judgment, reconstructive memory, is dependent on both resources and motivation in a compensatory fashion. The greater the motivation, in this particular case, the need for clarity, the need to have a very clear-cut memory, is dependent on how motivated you are to have it and how much energy you have, and both of these factors result in the suppression of interfering memory. So in the field of memory, you have the same kind of thing. Energy and motivation result in ability to form a clear-cut judgment and suppress, do the work that is required for suppression. Again, work, climbing the barrier, processing message arguments, suppressing interfering cognitions, both relate to the amount of work one is willing to expend, and these are functions of the motivational intensity, how important, how hungry the rat is, how motivated it is to get the food or whatever, and how much energy there is. The dopamine depletion reduces that, other caffeine and other drinks increase that, so it's very, very related. We're now doing research with James Goss on affect regulation, and this is the tendency to reinterpret very terrible affective stimuli, gory pictures that people want to turn away from, but there's a possibility of expanding work on reinterpreting them. Again, hard work, and that again seems to depend on the amount of motivation to reinterpret those stimuli and the amount of resources, energetic resources you have to do so. So it really cuts across a variety of different domains of behavioral research in social psychology. I would like to report just a few experiments from the domain of wishful thinking. Wishful thinking is extremely pervasive. It affects our judgment and decision making across domains of human activity, political decision making. Robert Jarvis talked about it in his work to a great extent, the kind of distortions that occur in concordance with one's desires, wishful thinking. In this particular case, the goal, the motivation part of the equation is the formation of a pleasing judgment. And in research so far on wishful thinking was assumed to occur when the stimulus is ambiguous. When the stimulus is ambiguous, it's easy to distort it. When stimulus is very clear-cut, the reality hits you in the face, it's difficult to distort it. In terms of the present conceptualization, it is not absolute. It was perceived as absolute. As, you know, once the reality constraints are there, you cannot distort it. We see it more as a relative issue, task demands, or difficulty of the task, or the required outlay of energy, which means that if you have enough energy, you can distort anything at all. Reality constraint is required outlay, and it can be overcome with a sufficient willingness to outlay the energy. If it's really important to you, if you have the energy to do it, you're going to distort whatever reality is being presented to you. Here's one study that shows that relative goal importance, one element in the equation, how motivated you are, is going to overcome reality constraints. So participants choose between two brands of tea. Their mission, should they decide to accept it, is to tell which one is tastier. And we label them as everyday smooth tea or nutrition essential tea. In one condition, the two teas were essentially the same. It was basically the same tea with different labels. This was the stimulus ambiguity condition because they were exactly the same. Low reality constraints. The outlay of resources, the outlay of energy in this particular case is very low because it's very easy to distort. In another condition, there was low ambiguity and high constraints. This is a reality constraint condition. one of the teas was substantially diluted. It was a bad tea to begin with, a Lipton tea, and now we diluted it even more, which made it totally awful. So this is high reality constraints. Presumably they should say that it's less tasty. Cross-cutting the stimulus ambiguity manipulation, have the participants are primed with a health goal. Remember, one of the tea was nutrition essential tea by a scrambled sentence technique, and the other half were not. This is the way it looked. As you can see, if you look at the blue bars, in the case of the neutral goal, which was one of the conditions, this was the health goal, in the neutral goal condition, participants are sensitive to the taste, are sensitive to the reality. In other words, they judge the diluted tea as less tasty than the non-diluted tea. However, once the goal of health is increased, that difference disappears. So this overcomes the reality constraints, even though you and I and everybody in this room would perceive the diluted tea as less tasty. These people apparently do not. So far, I talked about the role of the motivation to overcome reality constraints, the task difficulty in the case of wishful thinking. This is a study that shows that the other component of the equation, energetic resources, would have exactly the same kind of consequence. Participants here judge the extent to which the Mona Lisa is smiling and friendly. Half the participants are subliminally primed with a rejection prime, so they feel pretty bad. They want to feel at least she's friendly to them, if nobody else is. So this introduces an accepted inclusion goal. Half are exposed to an accuracy prime. Cross-cutting this manipulation will manipulate these energetic resources. Remember that energetic resources are assumed to be depleted by either previous or concurrent activity. So in this particular case, there is a cognitive load manipulation. It depletes their available resources at the moment. And as you can see, nothing much happens in the accuracy prime condition. In the rejection prime condition, and the low depletion, they see her as more friendly. When they are depleted, they cannot do so very well. Here I want to show you that part of the importance of this kind of theorizing is that it's content-free. It is assumed to apply to goals across different contexts, across different domains. Whatever the goal is, whether it's Red's goal to eat food or a human's goal to perceive acceptance and warmth in others, the very same mechanisms are assumed to apply across the board. In this particular set of studies, I want to demonstrate, or they demonstrate, that the resources do not have a mind of their own. Their energy doesn't have a mind of its own. Whatever goal is important, they will serve it. So it can serve the wishful thinking goal, but they can also serve the accuracy goal. If accuracy is at premium and it's difficult to attain accuracy, with resources, you can do it. Without resources, it's going to be difficult. That's what I just said, but it's written, so it's more persuasive like that. When balancing motivation is dominant and reaching a biased judgment is easy, low required outlay of energy, biased judgment will be made pretty much regardless of resources. You don't need resources because it's so easy. When reaching biased judgment is difficult because it requires a great deal of cognitive work, jumping over barriers, biased judgment will be made only in the presence of resources. And the same about accuracy motivation. When the accuracy motivation is dominant, hegemonious, and reaching unbiased judgments is easy, no resources would be necessary, no pool of mental energy would play a role. When reaching unbiased judgment is difficult because the situation impels the biased judgment, unbiased judgment will be more pronounced under high presence of energetic resources versus low. Now, in this case, we looked at, we were basing our studies on Livingstone work on biological mechanisms of perception, and she has been finding that the Mona Lisa smile is best seen by peripheral vision. When you look at her eyes, she appears to be more smiling. Try it at home. When you look at her mouth, she appears to be less smiling. So what we did is we put glitters on her mouth, which is difficult to bias towards smile, or we put glitter on her eyes, which is easy to bias towards smile, to manipulate the difficulty of the test or the required outlay of energy to see her smiling. The design of the study was a rejection prime, as in the previous study, or accuracy prime, load versus no load, to deplete the amount of energetic resources, and difficult to bias, easy to bias, difficult to bias, glitters on mouth or glitter on eyes. If you look at her very carefully, there you go. What we find is that when there is the motivation to see her smiling and the rejection prime, when there's a tendency to perceive her as smiling across the board. When you look at her eyes, it's easy to see her smiling, that's good. When you look at her mouth, it's difficult to see, but under no load, you can still manage. However, when you impose load and you look at her mouth, which is difficult, the energy outlay is too large, given the availability of resources, you see her as less smiling. And when the motivation is to be accurate, she is mysterious. She's neither smiling nor not smiling. When you look at her mouth, she's perceived as kind of ambiguous. When you look at her eyes with the resources intact, you still see her as ambiguous. However, when the glitters are on the eyes, which makes her look as if she was smiling, and there is load, even though you want to be accurate, you do perceive her as smiling. Which, again, all of which suggests that both motivation and resources are important in determining the success of cognitive activity, in this case, wishful thinking, to take place. So in conclusion, it's a testimony to people's energetic rationality. People expend energy in accordance with the amount of energy they have and how important a given outlay of energy is to them. It's a portion of energy according to requirements, benefits, and inclinations. It integrates findings from across multiple domains of psychology, economic, energetic matter, and I'm very excited to see the kind of brain work that's done by John and his team and Kent that really explore how these mechanisms are paralleled on the level of the brain, on the level of the neurotransmitters, dopamine, and the kind of drugs that affect dopamine depletion and its restoration. So I find this extremely exciting. Thank you.